What's going on, peeps and peepettes of the In Your Head Headyverse? This is XVII coming to you outside here in beautiful Spartanburg, South Carolina, my hometown of Spartanburg, South Carolina. And when you see the brick wall, you can rest assured that XVII is outside surveying the beautiful landscape that is the upstate part of South Carolina. Just absolutely gorgeous today. Thought I should come outside and do an episode of the Paradyme. Now, I don't have any mint juleps with me. I damn sure don't have Mickey James with me, although I wish I did. But I do have you peeps and peepettes out here in the Headyverse, here to check out the Secluded Paradyme. The one and only Secluded Paradyme. I'm XVII, Spectacular Sunset. Get it right. But you're not here to talk about my name. I'm not here to talk about your names. We are here today to discuss Portland Wrestling. That's right, Pacific Northwest Wrestling. You know, one of the greatest organizations to ever turn the pike back in the 1960s, 70s, and even for the better part of the 1980s. That organization was a regional monster, let's face it. When you talk about West Coast Wrestling, you got to talk about the AWA. You got to talk about several of the organizations that were present around California at the time. And you also got to talk about Portland Wrestling, Pacific Northwest Wrestling, owned, operated, and manipulated by the late Don Owen. One of the greatest minds ever in pro wrestling in terms of a managerial capacity, in terms of wrestling companies, and also in terms of being just a tremendous owner, someone who knew how to turn a profit, someone who understood the meaning of making fans care about professional wrestling in a particular area. Now, during this episode of the Paradyme, I'm not going to go all out and talk about every aspect of Pacific Northwest Wrestling. However, I will discuss several of the key people that were involved in that organization that made it such a monster during its time. And I'll also talk about some of the good angles that transpired in Portland Wrestling, and also the significance of that organization and how it created several stars that many of you would come to notice during the 1970s and 1980s as major figures, either in Jim Crockett Promotions or in the World Wrestling Federation, now of course known as World Wrestling Entertainment. Such names as Roddy Piper, such names as Playboy Buddy Rhodes, such names as Ric Flair. The list goes on and on with a lot of names that came through Portland Wrestling during the time. But for right now, you get a little gist of what I'm talking about and what I will discuss on the Paradyme, the number 17th edition of the Paradyme, if you will, to quote a Dusty Rhodes reference. However, before I go deep into the subject, I want you to check out this little clip right now. Not necessarily detailing Portland Wrestling, but detailing another endeavor altogether. See you later. Coming soon to B-Spec Productions.
¿Qué pasa, gringos? Desde Santo Loco.
Orgullosamente latino hasta la muerte y después. Worldwide Latino pride, the ambassadors of violence. LAX, K-Dog, the notorious 187 homicide.
Bang the dang the dang dang. Don't say nothing. Bang the dang the dang dang. We be dumping. Bang the dang the dang dang. Just act like you know and homie stop rocking.
Through stomping. I'm from Miami, not Compton. Down with the essays in the 6-4 hopping. To my Boricuas in the.
And welcome back to the Paradyme, peeps and peepettes. It's Spec once again coming at you with the Secluded Paradyme number 17, featuring Portland Wrestling, a.k.a. Pacific Northwest Wrestling. That's right, PNW. And prior to the break, I informed you guys and gals that I was going to discuss the history, the historical significance of this organization, and I'm going to do that right now. It's not going to be very long, but it's something that I need to get out there for you to get a good gist about what this organization was, how it began, and its significance to professional wrestling in general. Now, the organization itself, Pacific Northwest Wrestling, Portland Wrestling, was founded by the late, great Herb Owen. Now, Herb Owen is the father of the late, great Don Owen, the longtime promoter of Pacific Northwest Wrestling. Now, what many people do not understand is that this organization wasn't necessarily a member of the National Wrestling Alliance at the time. The NWA really didn't even form until 1948. During this portion of professional wrestling, during this era of professional wrestling, the NWA was the National Wrestling Association. Herb really wasn't a member of that organization just yet. It would be many years until he would be. Now, in 1925, between 1925 and 1948, for the most part, he was promoting non-wrestling events. For the most part, he was promoting boxing events. A legendary boxer by the name of Jack Dempsey performed in Owen's territory at the time, although albeit a very, very short period of time. He brought several big-name boxers in. Several different attractions went through that era. However, he did promote wrestling to a much degree later on during his reign as the owner there. To make a long story short, in 1948, he sells his ownership to his son, Don Owen, who in turn, and at the same time, was a prominent member of the new National Wrestling Alliance, which formed in 1948. And at that point, Don Owen decided to make this a strictly a wrestling territory, and my goodness, it became one of the biggest and most influential wrestling territories at the time. In essence, Pacific Northwest Wrestling was, in a sense, the Northwest territory for the National Wrestling Alliance. Of course, the NWA is all over the map here during this period of time. They have a monopoly over the industry. If you are a non-NWA member, it was very, very difficult for you to promote in the United States in general because they had a monopoly over the entire business. The same way that Cinema Pictures situation in Cinema Pictures back in the 1940s, where you only had about 2 or 3 different organizations that were promoting movies, that were distributing movies to certain outlets who were making films. The same thing goes for wrestling. There was only a few, very few select organizations that was actually promoting wrestling around the world. However, the organization that controlled professional wrestling in the United States was the National Wrestling Alliance, beginning in 1948 with several promoters, and Don Owen was just one of them. Now let's fast forward a little bit further. You go into the early 1950s. In the early 1950s, you have the evolution of television, all of a sudden becoming a huge media to so many people around the world in very, very short order. Of course, television really began around 1940. However, it made its presence felt in an entertainment form around the early 1950s. And in 1953, I believe, Don Owen produced the first wrestling show to ever be produced in wrestling. And it was called Heidelberg Wrestling, in response to their sponsor at the time was Heidelberg Brewing Company. And this show aired for a very, very, very long time. Had greats like Luthez, who was, of course, the NWA World Heavyweight Champion. He went through there. That's how he really became a huge known commodity at the time with the advent of television. You had a guy by the name of Gory Guerrero, the father of Eddie Guerrero, Chavo Guerrero Sr., Hector Guerrero. List goes on and on with the phenomenal Guerrero family members. Ed Francis, another tremendous wrestler during his time, mid-card to high card, phenomenal talent that entertained fans throughout the world. I mean, Pacific Northwest Wrestling was a major territory. It was a 60-minute live program that just took everybody by storm. I mean, if you look at some of the old pictures and videos of that time depicting television, sports in television at that time, you will see a lot of people stand around the street looking at a huge television set outside, right around in the display in a window of a store, and it will be fixated for hours. Where professional wrestling was one of those programs that was very premium, and fans cared enough and was entertained enough to go see. And that's what you had around 1953 and beyond throughout the 1950s. It was truly a golden age of television, and Don Owen was one of the figureheads in terms of professional wrestling being as popular as it eventually would become in the 1960s. You fast forward into the 1960s, and you have somebody of the name of Gorgeous George. Gorgeous George first made his name, his mark, whatever you want to call it, in Pacific Northwest Wrestling. That's where the whole Gorgeous George character came about. how it spanned out to so many different people around the world. It was entertaining, it was captivating, it was something different, something new. A guy who looked like he was dressed in drag, fluffing his hair, being so flamboyant to the point where you wanted to hate him. And he wanted you to hate him, and he wanted you to care. And cared to such a degree, he got his head shaved. So, and the legend goes, I mean, not really legend, this has really actually happened from what I hear. His wife entered the fray, and she got her head shaved. All of which displayed on Portland Wrestling. Very, very phenomenal company that several people remember. Now, another thing to discuss is the name Portland Wrestling itself. It sort of evolved around the 1950s as television became so popular. The name became popular. Well, Heidelberg Wrestling eventually became Portland Wrestling. They changed the name of the show, of the company. Not necessarily the company, but of the show at that time. The show was initially broadcast on the KPTV, according to several sources, eventually moving to the rival network of KOIN TV in 1955. But in Portland Wrestling became their moniker later in that decade. Now let's go on to the 1960s once again. And after the success of their television network and also the success of their house shows and etc., Don Owen opens up a facility in Portland called the Portland Memorial Coliseum in 1961. This will be a new benchmark, a new haven for Don Owen to promote his wrestling shows for a very, very long time. And this will allow him to bring in a lot of the big stars. I believe the Coliseum could hold up to nearly 16,000 fans in attendance, which was just phenomenal at that point in time. You didn't see many stadiums of that kind of capacity. Usually, the capacity numbers, at the Kiel Auditorium and stuff like that would most likely be under 15,000. Keep in mind, we're so spoiled over WrestleMania and the success of WrestleMania over the years, and seeing the attendance gates up to 60,000 or so like that. This was kind of equivalent to that same figure around the 1960s if you're involved in pro wrestling, because keep in mind, you're talking about studio wrestling, only seating a few hundred people, if that, for their shows. The shows are taped, and it doesn't have that live feeling to it, but Portland Wrestling is a little bit different. You got your money's worth with great feuds, great top card matches, mid card, low card matches, a little good balanced out card to fit your fix, so to speak, as a wrestling fan who want to see a little bit more on a bigger stage. Portland Wrestling gave you that. And he also didn't only go to Portland. He went to Seattle to book stuff. Keep in mind, this is a territory for Northwest Wrestling. Their foundation in Vancouver, British Columbia, comes into effect around this time period as well, where a lot of collaborations come into play with Don Owen and several promoters that were up in that area. So I just want you all out there to just get a little understanding about what this organization was. It wasn't just Portland, it was really Pacific Northwest. Portland was just like the main company inside that region.